to present on consumer and community involvement in health research. As we've talked about, you know, the label of consumer is not well received by people with lived experience, people living or with lived experience. Part of the system for us is that the government speaks in the language of consumer, so it does pop up in our language, but at this point, preferred language is lived experience. So I'm going to talk about what it looks like working with people with lived experience in research and just try to give you some overview on what that might look like. So with research, do we do it with people? Do we do it on people? Do we do it with, or is it led by consumers? So there's sort of three columns: on, with, or led by. So in the on column, this describes how most research has historically been conducted with consumers as subjects in research, with researchers being the authoritative figure. So this is not necessarily unethical, it's kind of just what's been done in the past, but it carries real limitations. The questions may not reflect what the communities actually need. And the findings can often fail to translate if it doesn't have that engagement piece. So when we're doing with, this is where most engagement frameworks sit, where consumers are genuine partners. They're involved in the designing, reviewing materials, interpreting findings, and also helping in that translation piece. And the evidence on this is generally that the outcomes are much more positive and translatable. In the furthest column, which is led by, this represents the highest level of consumer agency. It's less common in traditional academic settings, but well established in certain streams of health, such as mental health, First Nations health research. And the researcher's role becomes more of a facilitator rather than directive. And the key point is that it's led by, and this is the goal. And sometimes this might be challenging because it does take time, it takes organisational infrastructure, it takes resource allocation. So sometimes these might be the barriers that we face. And I'd ask you maybe to just take a stop here and reflect on where you're at in your current practice and where you would like to see yourself on your research journey. So why does the engagement with people with lived experience matter so much? And there's three kind of key areas. One is research quality. Evidence, as I said, is consistent that the more participatory approach that you take, the research questions are more relevant to that community, better recruitment, and also retention rates across your research. And this is documented in systematic reviews. Another one is funding. So generally funders, either government or philanthropic funders, now require long-term engagement with the communities that you're working with. They look for evidence that you have a relationship and have engaged in co-design and involvement across the development of a project and the running of the project, and then also the translation. And then there's the ethical argument. If your research affects people's lives, those people have a legitimate claim to shape it. And involvement shouldn't be a bonus, as it's a matter of the right thing to do. So we're not really asking whether to involve consumers now. We're asking how well do we do it. So we need to do some self-reflection and some looking at how we do things, or if we're in that early career phase, how do we want to place ourselves and be seen as a researcher that engages or partners, let's say, well with the lived experience community that they're working with. There are levels of engagement that we can do with the communities we're working with, and they range from just informing consumers about what we're doing, and really no information or input is sought, all the way through to empowering, where the consumers are leading. And it is fair that we do different levels of engagement, but ideally we really want to move away from just telling consumers what we're doing or even consulting. I was in a meeting the other day where there was this big research project, and the researchers are very committed to doing good engagement with the community they're working with, but the language across every piece of paper was that they're going to consult. And it didn't reflect the level of engagement that they were looking to do. So I think it's really important that the language we use when we're talking to people with lived experience that we're working with, that it really reflects how we're going to work with them. So yeah, I encourage you to take a minute and maybe look at the projects that you're working on at the minute and where you currently sit on that spectrum of engagement. So the expectation in terms of where consumers come in across the research life cycle is really from ideation. Or, in fact, as I mentioned before, that we actually have long-term relationships with consumers in the area that we're working. So, for example, if you're working in epilepsy, then we have a long-standing consumer advisory committee that we reach out to, and over time we build a partnership with them around priorities that set the kind of research agenda that we are going to carry out. And that's really important, that they feel that they have some say in the priorities over their health condition. It really says to them that what they're going through is valuable in the scheme of changing the health system for the better. So consumers can do this through priority setting activities, and also in the design of research. It's really helpful to have lived experience in the design of any research, so that it's accessible and achievable in terms of the way the research is structured, in terms of appointments, in terms of touch points with the research team. It's invaluable information for anyone setting up a research project, and many hiccups in research have been prevented by having consumers involved in that shaping of what the research looks like. We can also have engagement in how the ethics look, so reading over ethics applications on consent forms, making sure they're in layman's terms and that there's no wording in there that might trigger an unwanted response, and that you're going to get the response to the research that you're looking for, that you have people who are engaged and really wanting to help you reach the conclusions of your research. And the last stage of the research cycle is analysis and translation. And this is returning your findings to those working with you, but also a broader range in the community for validation of what you've found, and it really strengthens your credibility. Authorship on papers is expected on a number of journals now, so making sure that across your projects that you're actually building capacity in consumers so that they can become authors on the written journal papers that come out as part of your grant. Apologies. So you want to get the basics right. So what does that look like? If we're going to bring someone into our research project, we really want to have role clarity, and that's for both the research team and also those that you're bringing in with lived experience. Because if you don't both have the same expectation and clarity, then it can lead to areas where you're not aligned. So, for example, if you're expecting someone to come in once a month, but they were thinking they might be able to participate online, which is fair. We should be making things accessible. If you just need to have that clarity. And so, one of the things that I do is have like an onboarding a form. So it sets out what the project is, what the engagement, like where are they going to be involved, where they're going to be able to influence, how often, why we want them, how are you going to pay them, etc., for the whole length of the project. And I think that's really important. So both parties have the same expectation. Other basics are that early involvement. So you don't want someone just giving you a letter on your grant application. You want to have them involved, have that buy into what you're trying to achieve, because you will find that, or certainly in my experience, is people have a real investment in having a voice in the condition in which they're facing, or someone that they care for. Plain language is really important to make sure that things are readable, and not excluding anyone with without the same health literacy levels. We are now expected to fairly reimburse lived experience expertise, and the budget should be appropriate to that, include transport, access costs. If you're having team meetings where people from different areas are going to meet for investigator meetings or steering committee meetings, you should include travel coverage for the consumers to be at the table for those meetings as well. Also, it's important to remember that people with lived experience do come with a lot of experience in the health system. Some of it may be positive, some of it may be negative, and we need to be sure that we're setting up the right supports when we bring them into research. So it's generally good to have a support person. So who is the contact person in your research team that any lived experience person can reach out to if they've got any questions, if they feel that the meetings are not going the way they want, they don't feel like they can speak up, so they can sort of troubleshoot with a support person within the team. I think it's really important they know who they can turn to if they have questions. So what might get in the way of good engagement, and what can we do about it? And in saying this, I feel that if we're addressing the basics, then hopefully we're preventing some of the things that get in the way. There are systemic challenges in the research academic space, and those are, organisational structure and support of consumer engagement. Is there funding? Often we don't get funding for consumer engagement until a project is up and running, and then how do we do authentic engagement prior to a project? So there are barriers in which we have to overcome, and so these need to be worked through. Some of the things just to highlight is maybe sort of attitudes coming into the project. So researchers might feel that it's hard work. They don't feel supported in terms of the time to do it well. They know, like a lot of, most people know that, this engagement piece is really important, but how do we do it if there's not the time and the resources? And the researchers that I work with at the minute are just so overwhelmed and time poor. So we need to give enabling structures to be able to do it in a effective way. And consumers can also come in with some scepticism about what their involvement's going to look like. And so again, going back to that setting the scene and expectations, there is a really important step to do right up front. We also need to consider the power imbalance and tokenism. We want to set up the process that each person voice is equal. If the consumer voice or the lived experience voice is not as experienced, so that there will be some people who are very experienced and happy to sit at a table with a range of different professionals, but there will be some who are new to this, or just need more support, and then it might be optimal to have 2 or 3 consumers in the room, so there's that balance of power between lived experience and professional experience. We also need to look at reflecting true diversity. So how can we bring diverse lived experience into our projects? That could be rural and regional families. It could be cold families. It could be the Indigenous population. And it's important that we do get that range of diversity. The other thing to consider is also consumer fatigue. There is often a call on the same consumers, which is not great practice, and understand why it happens. But we need to be cautious and aware of fatigue that they may have in being asked to be involved in a number of different projects. And that does place maybe some burden on them and their families. I just want to also touch on the principles of consumer and community involvement, and that is authentic relationships, inclusion of diverse perspectives, valuing those contributions. And one of the things in that is closing the loop. We often forget to close the loop, and people will feedback that they helped out the whole project, and then it finished and there was nothing else. But we want to know how it impacted. How did we change things? Who's seen the report? Who's read the document? Where are you taking next? That's a really important thing. And it shows value of that contribution. Another consideration, particularly in the paediatric palliative care space, is considering previous trauma that people with lived experience may have, and you should consider a trauma-informed approach to that engagement in the paediatric palliative care area. Finally, I just wanted to touch on co-design, because it is thrown around a lot these days, and it's a great practice. It is a very resource-intense project, and we need to make sure that we're doing this in an authentic and considered way, because it may not be possible to do co-design in its true definition. So co-design is really where we've asked people with lived experience to change one thing. And it might be, we want to develop a new clinic. What does that look like? And how do we co-design what that looks like so it suits those people coming into that clinic? And you would involve them right across. And I think it's important just to highlight that co-design is not linear. It's not like we start at one point and we finish at another. We often we're all on the same page, and as we start getting into the detail, it gets very messy, and in the middle it becomes quite, I'll say hectic, but there's a lot of conversations, discussions, and potentially tensions as you work out what's important within that space. And then you come out the other end with something that has genuinely been co-designed. I think if you go in a fully linear line when you're doing co-design, you haven't really got into the nuts and bolts and really challenged each other on what is really needed for success on the project that you're working on. So true co-design needs that real investment, whether it's people or money or time, actually. Sometimes we might need to employ a facilitation expert as well to make sure we can move through all those potential questions and challenges that people might have in that middle process. And again, going back to good practice, we would want to have honest expectations around what can and can't be co-design. And by that, an example in this in this example of designing a clinic would be, we can't make it 3 times bigger, but we can design on the space that we've had. So one of the other things I touched on was choosing the right method of engagement. And the reason I popped this into this this talk in particular is that the cohort, the community, the people with lived experience in paediatric palliative care are either in a very critical crisis point where it's very difficult for the family in that palliative care, and that we may need to consider that having an advisory group or interviewing on a phone for an hour or setting up a focus group may not be the right thing for those people. They may need you to go and have a coffee with them and sit down and work through what you want to engage with them on. And I think it's just really important to consider and be flexible in approaches in this community, and be really considerate of where they may be in their journey with palliative care support. And I guess with that is just, again, to remember some trauma-informed practice and harm minimisation. And I'll put some notes about where you can get more information on that in my notes that the CRE will post. But something I think to remember is that as consumers, we all come into our relationship with researchers with a history, and it's important not to make assumptions about where families are, because on any given day it can change. So some days it might be okay to have really deep and challenging conversations, and they want to go there, and then other days it might be I'm just going to sit in the room and listen. So it's important to be aware, ask questions, as the family said earlier in the video, to ask questions. I think it's important to ask them where they're at and what is okay on any given day. And with that, I am going to hand over to the next presenter. Thank you.